Okay. Now, there were Minnesota connections with Pearl Harbor. One of the young men wanted to have a sailor hat. He really wanted a sailor hat. And his dad said, well, if you want a sailor hat, get your own, kid. And so he had signed for him, and basically if you were under 18 and you wanted to go to war, or you wanted to be in the Army or the Navy, you could if your dad or your parents signed for you. So he was in the Navy, and he was on the ward, and he was stationed at Pearl Harbor. Now, early one Sunday morning, they're stationed outside of the Pearl Harbor entrance, and there's supposed to be submarine nets, heavy nets made of metal that were pulled up over the harbor's entrance to make sure that no submarines managed to sneak in. Well, the ward is doing its monitoring, and they see a ship go in, and they see something that looks like a submarine. It's a smaller one, it's about the size of a bus, but it's still, a submarine. And so they hail it, they do what they're supposed to, and they drop a depth charge on it, and they shoot it down. And they quick told the people in the harbor at Pearl Harbor that they had done that, but they didn't do anything about it. And so the very first shots fired at Pearl Harbor were fired by Minnesotans on the ward, and they shot down the first of the mini-subs that was going to attack at Pearl Harbor. Now, the second story I'm going to tell is about Africa and Italy. There was a guy named Mr. Kressel, and he was a sergeant, and from the United States, and he fought in Africa first. So the idea was they were going to attack in Africa, because of course you have to get a hold of the Suez Canal, you have to get a hold of oil, and he said it was really hard fighting in Africa because all that sand and grit would get into the American machines and just grind them to a halt. But he eventually was able to do that, and then he fought in Italy. So they were working their way back onto the continent from they talk about the warm underbelly of Europe, which was Italy. And so they fought in Italy, and they're fighting up in the mountains. And he said that, nowadays when somebody's hurt and they can get them to the hospital right away, that's not the way it was up in Italy. When you got wounded, it sometimes took 24 hours for people to carry you down the mountains and get you to a safe place. And so he was talking about that. And one of my students asked Mr. Kressel if he had ever been wounded and if he had any medals, and he got really embarrassed. And he said, well, yes, I have a Purple Heart, and you get a Purple Heart when you're wounded, and I was wounded, but I'm really embarrassed about it. Because what he was doing is when they were marching into one of the Italian cities, and they're marching in, I think either there or maybe even later when it was in Rome, but he was marching in, they were victorious, they had won, and somebody got so excited that instead of throwing a flower at him, the lady got so excited she threw the whole bouquet, and it hit him right in the eye, and he got a scratched eyeball, and he had to go to the hospital. And since he was wounded in action, he did have a Purple Heart. Now, he was very modest about what he did. What he did was he was a person that went behind enemy lines, and he would figure out where the enemy was, and then he would radio back and give the coordinates so that people would know where to shoot it. So that's what was going on. The third guy was a Mr. Tut, and Mr. Tut was on a ship that was, the torpedo hit it, and guys are trying to get off, and the ship's in flames, and they're trying to get down. And as he went down the side, he lost control of the rope he was holding, and it burned his hands. He just slid down that whole rope, and it burned him really, really badly. And he felt that he should have been given a Purple Heart for that. If a guy's going to get a Purple Heart for being hit in the face with a flower, then he ought to get that. But it never got turned in, and it never got done, and he didn't get his Purple Heart for having that. Now, Mr. Hinchcliffe came and was talking about what happened as a paratrooper. Now, to understand the idea of being somebody who jumps out of an airplane was really a new idea. And when he first heard about it, he didn't know what it was. He just knew that if he signed up to be a paratrooper, they would give him extra money. And he thought, well, that's okay. You know, like a paratrooper might be a paraprofessional, and he's kind of a halfway trooper. I'll do that. Well, when he went into training and found out they expected him to jump out of an airplane, he just about jumped out of his skin, because he's going, whoa, I don't want to do that. But he did. And he was flown over France the day before D-Day, and paratroopers were dropped. And one of the things the paratroopers knew is that if you were landing on land, you rolled into a ball so that when you hit, you could just keep rolling and you would just, you know, you wouldn't hurt yourself. And you knew that if you were landing on water, you would extend your legs and point your toes so that you could cut right through the water. Well, what happened, of course, is that the Nazis figured that out. And so what they did to be especially mean is they flooded the fields, only to the, like, 2 feet deep. And so a paratrooper coming down on his parachute would see water, and he would prepare to land in water. So he'd straighten his legs and point his toes, and lots of them broke their legs and ankles as they landed. Now, I think Mr. Hinchcliffe had actually landed and got tied up in a tree, and he had to cut himself down, and he worked his way to the local town, and he and the others fought their way in because they wanted to get control of that town so that they could help the other troopers when they came the next day at D-Day. And Mr. Hinchcliffe had brought along a great big Nazi flag, and it had brown spots on it, brown marks on it. And one of my students asked him what the brown marks were, and he was pretty terse. He said, it's blood. And the kid said, well, how did it get all bloody like that? And he said, well, there was a Nazi who seemed to think that there should be a Nazi flag flying in that town, and I disagreed with him. And the kid said, did you kill him? And he said, I'm not going to talk about it. Then the next one is the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Now, in the Battle of Leyte Gulf, it was a new kind of war because you didn't have battleship against battleship. The battleships had been destroyed, you know, they were rebuilt at Pearl Harbor, but they didn't have battleships. They had aircraft carriers. And so one of the men, Mr. Kamakazie, was on a aircraft carrier, and he said he's watching, and he, you know, you can barely even see that there's a battle going on. Way in the distance, there is flashes, there's lights in the sky, and there's flashes of lights, and so they know there's a battle going on way away from them. And then all of a sudden he sees an airplane, a Japanese airplane, coming straight at the ship, and everybody's going, yike, duck, and they go to duck down, and the next thing you know, the pilot of that airplane swerves to the side, and he crashes his plane right smack into the side of the ship that Mr. Kamakazie is on, and that whole side of the ship goes up in flames. And it took him a lot of work and a lot of dead people before they could get that ship and the fire put out and go on and do more fighting. The last thing I'll mention is Brigadier General Sheehan once came and talked to my students long time ago. And his job was to plan for the attack on Japan. And America knew, because they had, you know, when they'd fought at Guadalcanal, when they fought at Iwo Jima, when they fought at little islands, they knew that there were, if they got the Japanese surrounded, the Japanese would kill themselves rather than be taken alive. And there were even women who would throw their children off cliffs and jump after them rather than be taken. And so Brigadier General Sheehan said he knew that if America had tried to attack Japan, it would be a street-by-street, house-by-house battle. And if we won, it was going to cost us at least 1 million American lives. That's not even talking about all the Japanese that would be killed. And so when they dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and then again on Nagasaki, Mr. Brigadier General Sheehan was so relieved because he said otherwise we would have lost. Yeah, there were a lot of Japanese who were killed, but not nearly as many Japanese as would have been killed if America had actually had to go in and fight there.